We've got a great presentation today. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Patty Johnson, the co-chair of the Women's Home Delivery Council, and Natasha Carey. Natasha, why don't you take it from here? Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Don. Thank you all for tuning in today. For those who don't know me, my name is Natasha Carey. I am with CODE, which stands for Certification of Delivery Excellence. We provide online education and certification for last mile professionals. I am so excited to become co-moderating with Patty again and to continue the Women's Council Well-Behaved Women Rarely Make History webinar series. If you missed our first webinar titled Changing Perspectives in Home Delivery, you can find it on the NHDA website. Today's webinar, An Hour with a Gritty Woman, is going to be a great follow-up from our last discussion. And as we go through the presentation, if you have any questions, please put those into the chat box. We will be monitoring that and we'll work those into our presentation. For now, I'm going to turn it over to Patty so she can introduce our dynamic speaker.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We have the very great privilege of spending an hour with a very gritty woman, Shannon Huffman Polson. Shannon is a woman of many firsts. She's one of the first women to fly an Apache combat helicopter in the United States Armed Forces, where she served on 3 continents and led 2 flight platoons, and a line company. After nearly a decade as an Army officer and attack aviation leader, Shannon transitioned through her MBA at Dartmouth to become a leader and manager in the corporate sector at Guidant and Microsoft. Now Shannon has turned her attention to the story of leadership as author of The Grit Factor, Courage, Resilience, and Leadership in the most male-dominated organization in the world, and as the founder of the Grit Institute, with robust training in leadership and grit, dedicated to whole leader development in times of challenge and change. So with that, I will turn it over to Shannon.
Thank you so much. What a pleasure to be here. I have the opportunity, I think, to join you in August as well. So this is just the beginning of a preview. But I want to take you this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are, out onto the tarmac in Alabama. Tarmac towards the Apache helicopter that I was going to fly was a winter day in Alabama. I had my flight jacket zipped all the way up, the collar turned up against the cold, but the shivers that I had going up and down my spine had very little to do with the temperature. I walked out on the tarmac on that winter morning, and I saw that Apache crouching there, looking like an enormous praying mantis lined up with other Apaches also crouching there. I walked out on the tarmac on that morning, looking at that aircraft, the most technologically advanced helicopter in the world. It's powered by 2 1,850 horsepower jet engines. On its wings hangs any combination of the 2.75-inch folding fin aerial rocket and the anti-tank Hellfire missile. Under its belly is slung the 30-millimeter high explosive cannon. On its nose are 3 different sight systems that see in day and night and adverse conditions. I walked out on the tarmac that morning and I thought, who am I to fly this thing? I was an English major in college. And right there on the tarmac in that moment, I had to make a decision. I had to decide that I was going to own my own story. I had to decide to take control of my own narrative. I had to decide to be better than any of the doubts that I was feeling, or any of the doubts that I had heard expressed around me about why women think they need to fly this thing anyway. So I walked out on the tarmac toward that aircraft. I put one foot up onto the wheel, the other foot up onto the forward avionics bay, and I opened that all glass cockpit that opens up and out like a Lamborghini. I've never been in a Lamborghini, but who needs to if you get to fly this thing anyway? There's a very small one here. I swung myself into that front seat, lowered myself into the cockpit, began the run-up procedure that I would know so well that I would know it by heart, but I would always use the checklist. The power levers advance. The rotors come to full RPM, you release the brakes and taxi out on the runway towards takeoff. Now, if we get to be live in August, or when we get to be live, I like to say, which way do you take off in the Apache helicopter? Does anybody know? I often hear up, which is of course the ultimate destination. But I like to remind them that in the Apache, like in any other aircraft, you turn the nose to face the wind. And when you use it the right way, the resistance will help you to rise. In the Apache, like in any other aircraft, you turn the nose to face the wind. And when you use it the right way, the resistance will help you to rise. Now, I may give you that same story in August, who knows? But Patty, thank you for such a wonderful introduction. I did have the opportunity a number of years ago to be one of the first women to fly the Apache helicopter in the United States Army. I led 2 flight platoons and a flight company. Those are all the line units with the Apaches on 3 different continents before I transitioned through my MBA at the Tuck School at Dartmouth and spent time leading outstanding teams in the corporate world as well. And one of the lessons that came up from those years in uniform around the world and the years in the corporate world as well are a couple of things. The first thing is that leadership does not have to do with rank or position or the number of direct reports you have or you don't have. Leadership begins when you make the decision to lead, when you make the commitment to exceed the standard and to make a difference. But the second thing that came out as absolutely critical, and the studies support this as well, is that a key ingredient to success, especially in the times like all of us are going through right now, a key ingredient to the success for any and every single one of us is that elusive, sometimes elusive thing that I have always called grit. Now, in the course of writing The Grit Factor, just released last September from Harvard Business Review Press, I had the opportunity to interview leaders in the vanguards of their fields. They happened to be women, they happened to be military. They faced what we call a double crucible. Not only the challenges of deployment, of combat, of all of those things that the military offers at any given moment, but also the challenge of being one of the first women to do those roles in the position where they sometimes had to work against resistance in their day-to-day as well. And what comes out of all of their stories and all of those lessons learned and all of the supporting research as well is that the grit factor is not just some small discrete thing that we pull off the shelf when things get tough, which is a good thing, because over the course of this last year and going into 2021, it's not just a discrete event, is it? It's really the time that we face in every single day. So grit is not that discrete element. It is something that is part of the fabric of our character. It is something that we build in to ourselves and into the person that we are and the way that we face challenges. And as I talked to these incredible leaders and put their experiences along with my own, there were 3 things that come out with the grit factor: commit and learn and launch. Now, when we get back together later this year, we'll talk a little bit more about all of those phases. But today, I wanted to really focus on the commit phase, because in the midst of turbulence, in the midst of change, in the midst of uncertainty, I like to remind people to go back to the basics. Go back to your foundation. The commit phase of the grit factor lines up with owning your own story, walking out on that tarmac, facing something that seemed impossible, and deciding in that moment that I was going to own my own story. Every challenge that we face, every obstacle that we come up against, we're walking out on that tarmac, facing that obstacle, and we come to a moment where we have to decide. We have the opportunity to decide to own our own story. The second part of that is drilling down to core purpose. Now, I like to say that you find grit not just in military pilots, not just in big mountain climbers. Thankfully for all of us, grit is part of every single one of us. It's something that we can find, and it's something that we can build. Now, that seems almost impossible in a time like what we've all gone through in the last year. But that's where we come back to the basics first. Commit is that work of owning your past, of reconnecting to the foundations of what matters most so that you can deeply engage in the present, that's the learn phase, so that you can look towards the future with audacity, with authenticity, and with, as we all know after this last year, adaptability. So owning your own story comes first. Every leader understands that before he or she is ready to lead an initiative, before he or she is ready to lead a team or an organization, we first have to do the work to own our own stories. Now, in the training at the Grit Institute and also in the Grit Factor, I'll walk you through a couple of exercises to do this work for yourself. But think about it this way. We're all given the raw material of our lives. We don't always choose that raw material. Very few of us would have chosen what happened over the course of this past year, even what some of us are still going through today. And yet we have both the opportunity and the responsibility to take the raw material of our lives and form it in a way that leads us in the direction where we can best contribute to this world. That's the work of owning our own story. When I walked out on the tarmac toward that Apache, there were voices in my head that I had just started to hear around me, that women really didn't need to fly this thing anyway. And I remember that when I was still a cadet in college, before ever going to flight school, I was part of the ROTC program. I was drilling with the National Guard. I remember driving out to receive my assignment for the years ahead to the state aviation officer in North Carolina. I was only 19 years old, hadn't yet turned 20 years old. And I remember reporting to that colonel, trying not to shake too much. He seemed like he sat behind a desk as wide as the room with shiny plate glass windows going up behind him. And I saluted and he asked me to sit down. And then we exchanged a couple of civil pleasantries back and forth before the interchange I would never forget. When he stopped mid-sentence, leaned back in his chair, looked down his nose at me and said, "You realize, cadet, that you will never fly an attack aircraft." Well, I looked back at him. I recognized his comment for what it was meant to be, which was small and mean and cutting, because in the spring of 1993, attack aircraft weren't open for women to fly. But I also had realized at that point that there were some times that you had to say, "Yes, sir." So I said, "Yes, sir." And then I drove back to the campus of Duke University and requested a transfer out of the National Guard and onto active duty. Well, later that spring, Congress changed the game on that colonel and everybody else, lifted the combat exclusion clause, and suddenly every aircraft in the inventory was open to women and men to fly. And I thought that the sky was the limit. I could give you dozens of interactions like that. There are plenty of times when people are going to tell you no, when people are going to question why it is that you're there, when events might conspire to get in your way, when it seems like a global pandemic is interfering with what those goals are that you had in front of you. Now, Angela Duckworth at the University of Pennsylvania, who does the deep research on grit, has said that grit is passion and perseverance towards a very long-term goal. And that's fantastic. But I've called it a dogged determination in the face of difficult circumstances, because there are times, like the time that we're all living through right now, where that horizon is unclear. We're not sure always exactly which direction we're heading. That's very disorienting. It can be very disturbing. What do you do when you can't see that horizon? When you don't always feel that passion because maybe the fatigue is building up. Maybe it's just an environment where your family or even the workplace can be a really high anxiety place. What do you do then? That's where that dogged determination comes into play. But remember, and I think this is a really important thing to take away, especially in these times, and I think things are going to change by August. I'm certainly hopeful that they will. That dogged determination, that grit, is so critical to our success, but it's not a sustainable operating mode. It's something that we have. It's something that we can build. We're going to talk more about that in August, but it's not a sustainable operating mode. And so in this time, when things do seem to be a bit uncertain, when things still are unclear on those long-term horizons, what do? We come back to the basics. That's the commit phase of the grit triad of commit, learn, and launch. Coming back to the basics. We own our own story. We look at this raw material we've been given and say, this isn't necessarily what I asked for, not necessarily what I would have hoped to have been dealing with. But I know that I have the agency, I have the opportunity, I have the responsibility to shape this in a meaningful way, to show up and say, what is my story going to be at the end of this challenge? What is that narrative going to be of how I negotiated this and how we came out together stronger? Because we will get through this and we will get through it together. How do I own my own story, drill down to core purpose, and to those things that matter most? When you connect to that foundation, when you do the work to go back to what matters most, you can maneuver. Once you're anchored to that, you can maneuver through any kind of turbulence that comes your way. So this is just the warm up for August, but I thought it would be a great place to start, reconnecting to foundations, reconnecting to core purpose and to our own stories, understanding that grit is critical to our success. That you can envision any time that you're running into challenge, when you're running into fear or failure or something that seems absolutely impossible to surmount. Imagine yourself walking out on that tarmac, putting your foot up onto that wheel, opening that cockpit and climbing in. You can own your own story. And when you own your own story, when you drill down to core purpose, that's the foundation of the grit that will get you through every single time. I'm excited for us to reconvene in August, but in the meantime, I'm looking forward to our conversation today. I'd love your questions.
That was fantastic. Your insight is amazing and your energy is amazing. It's funny, we have somebody here in the chat saying that you're the real life Captain Marvel, which I have to say, absolutely, I agree. So I will start with one question first, which is, as being a woman of first, or like you've said, being the first in anything, you're going to stand out, but you want to still make sure you're fitting in. And so you're not, standing out all the way here on your own and kind of creating your own environment. So how do you stand out while still fitting in?
That's such a great question. And, as I look at the grit triad now, and, I really actually came up with the grit triad. Commit, learn, and launch are the three sections of the grit factor. And it really comes out of the stories and the lessons learned told by these other outstanding leaders in the vanguards of their fields. It's how the book breaks out naturally. It's how the lessons break out naturally. But in that last phase is launch. And that's really how we're engaging and looking towards the future. And I bring this up because one of those chapters is on authenticity. And it can be really, really difficult if you are one of the first women, one of anything in a field where you are the minority. It's absolutely a challenge because we know that you have to in some way embrace the vision and the mission, of course, of the organization. You have to embrace the culture in some way. Hopefully you've chosen a place where that culture is very much aligned with what your values are and what your core purpose is. So long as you've done that work to own your own story, to drill down to core purpose, and you stay connected to that, then I think with that connection, you're able to maneuver in that culture that you'll need to find some ways to align with. Again, you never want to violate core values. You never want to violate core purpose. And I'll tell you the story of first showing up at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. I was 23 years old. I was newly trained in the Apache helicopter. And when I drove out to the 229th Attack Aviation Regiment, there's 2 battalions of Apaches. There were 120 male combat pilots. And I, at age 23, was the only woman, the first woman to show up to that line unit. So I showed up and realized I don't want anyone to be able to say anything about what it is that I'm trying to do. I have my hair cut very, very short, something I somewhat regret at this later. As my husband said, looking back at those pictures, he said, I don't think you want to do that again. Some people can pull that off, but I didn't want them to be able to say anything like, gosh, she thinks she should be able to have a different standard because she's different. So I tried to make sure that my physical PT test is what we call it, the physical training test. And in the Army, you think, well, hey, the physical training test is the most important thing, and it often is in units, but in aviation, it wasn't, but I wasn't going to let them bring that up either. So I made sure I could max everything, which means get the maximum score. And I basically wanted to show up and make sure there were no excuses. The reality is you stand out by who you are, no matter what you do. And so that's the challenge. You're in a fishbowl in some form or fashion. And I think what's really important is to remain connected to your story, remain connected to your core purpose and your core values so that you don't violate those in the adaptations that you try to make within the context of a given culture. And I would say that's really the key takeaway, is going back to those foundations, staying connected to those foundations, and then finding ways to maneuver within the culture. Both are important, and it is absolutely a dance and a challenge, but people have done it before, and you can do it too.
So another question, despite doing the things that you did to fit in and while standing out,
Sure.
what unique expectations do you think you faced that your myriad male counterparts maybe did not?
Yeah, in this particular case, and I would say this is true again for any minority and entering a majority field, right? So this might be based on gender or race or any other characteristic. I think the challenge is that you are being evaluated much more closely than anybody else. And that's just the reality of it, no matter what people try to say. There's a lot of studies that have been done around that in terms of the importance, for example, of taking risks, and yet being judged more when you do take that risk, or if you fail in the course of taking that risk, which of course failure, and I know that's going to be one of our questions that comes up later, failure is always part of the path to success. Every leader knows that. You have to take on those risky assignments and those challenging assignments. And yet, when you do that as a minority, minorities are often judged more for either taking that risk on at all or not taking the risk, or for failing when they take that risk. And so it's one of those things where you really, I think, have to stay totally focused on the work, totally focused on the effort, and really try to put blinders on for anybody who's a naysayer. I mean, that's just, it's really hard work. And it's something that you've got to train yourself to do. And at the end of the day, after enough iterations of taking on challenges and succeeding, or picking yourself up after a failure and continuing to take on bigger challenges, eventually I like to think or hope that in a healthy culture, at least, those contributions will be recognized. But always your work will be evaluated more closely than a counterpart. And that's the reality of it. And I think we all know it when we walk into those circumstances. I think in terms of, and I see there's a number of men on this call, which is outstanding. Men can be outstanding allies in this process for understanding those social realities. The studies are very, very clear on this. And so as a male leader or a male manager, understanding that, I think, can help to mitigate some of the challenges of that as well.
So as far as, we talk about grit and it's hard work and you have to keep going, right? And I like how, you tie it back to passion and perseverance and purpose, right? So you kind of have to really do some work into realizing your passion and your purpose in order to find your grit, right? Because if you don't have your passion and your purpose, then why do you keep going, right?
Yes.
So as a manager, as a leader, right? Because sometimes we have leaders who are not in necessarily managerial roles, but sometimes our managers need to lead and help their team through that. So how do you work with people, or what's your philosophy on, as a manager, how do you deal with failure? And maybe it's a two-part question. It's not just the failure, but how do you help people find their passion or their purpose in order to then tie in grit to that?
Yeah, that is a good and an important question, because this is work for managers and leaders to help their people do the same work that the manager and leader needs to do themselves. There absolutely is that really important internal work to do. I'm going to tell you 2 ways to do it, and then a third way, actually, because the first 2 are going to point you towards the grit factor, which is going to give you very specific tactical lessons in doing exactly that work. And also at the Grit Institute, I have both online training available for individuals, or that I can help your team work through. But as a leader or a manager, I would say the most important thing for you to do is to lead by example, which is to do that work first. Yourself. And because you need that passion and perseverance and that dedication and that connection, that work to drill down, to do the work, to own your own story and to own your own core purpose first, right? Once you've done that work, and leading by example, I think, is always the best way to lead. There's no question, right? That's the leading from the front, leading by example. And then you can do that same work even in the context of a meeting that can still be on Zoom, just like we're doing today. It can be in person once we get to that place again as well, is to walk your team through those same exercises. Read the book, do those exercises together as a team, or ask me to come in and facilitate it, either way. But I think sharing your experience as a leader or a manager is a really wonderful way to both be a little bit vulnerable, to be willing to share what your own process is, which is it's interesting. This wasn't the case 20 years ago, right? But it is the case today. And I think that our leadership is much better for the increased acceptance of, and actually sort of requirement for some vulnerability, to be real as a leader, to be willing to share some of your own experiences, and not just connecting to passion and purpose and core purpose, but Natasha, like you just said, being willing to share your experiences of failure too. Like, hey, you know what? I've been having a tough week, or I really thought I was going to get this thing done, and I just couldn't do it because of this, and I'm going to have to address it a different way. Sharing that as a leader is important to your people. And I think it's important for a couple of reasons, but for sure, when you're establishing a culture where you want to encourage people to try new things, to take risks, that means that sometimes people are going to fail. As a manager or a leader, you probably know that already, but your people need to know that as well if you want them to take these risks, to really stretch and take on new assignments, to grow as a leader themselves or grow in their roles, but also to really be innovative for your company, right? You have to have a culture that allows that. And in order to do that, you've got to show that you're willing to take risks yourself. And you've got to be willing to share what it's like for you to experience failure and to get up and to move forward. So again, then you're leading by example, and you're establishing that culture that allows that. I talked to a client, this is now several months ago, and this was one of their goals, like, hey, we've got to get people to take more risks. And I will say, like, even for the engagement itself, we had, I mean, my goodness, we must have had 8 rehearsals. And I thought, wow, I understand why people aren't willing to take risks. I mean, there's just this incredible extreme control around this. And if you want to take risks and teach people to take risks, you've got to look at how it is that you're presenting yourself. And that's hard work as a leader, but that will help your followers or help your team and your organization really be able to grow and contribute in meaningful ways.
Well, I can't wait to dive into the book. And is there, I can't imagine what goes into writing a book and putting all that together. Is there anything that you didn't include now that you've gone through the process? Is there anything that didn't make it in the book that you've wished that you had? Or
2 things. The first is, although the 3 sections of the book break out into commit, learn, and launch, really thinking of it as a triad, and I actually can send this to you as well via Luan, so you all will have this while you order your books as well, but is looking at the grit triad. And I think thinking of it as a triad because they all support each other, right? Commit supports learn, supports launch. And I have it all surrounded by this circle of what we're going to get into a lot more in August called grounded optimism, which is a mindset that we choose every single day. There's so much about this that is choice, right? The way that we choose to engage a challenge, the way that we choose to show up in the world. And I think that's a really important thing, is to own that choice and own that opportunity and own that responsibility. So the grit triad is one. The second thing, and nobody could have guessed what was going to happen in 2020, right? 2020, I think, threw every single person in the world right for a loop. But at the same time, as I was thinking about the launch of the Grit Factor, it just came out in September. And I thought, gosh, could it be a better time to talk about grit? We're going through a global pandemic and social unrest and political upheaval and all of this crazy stuff, and not just in our country, in the rest of the world. And that's true. I think it's important to understand, though, and this is not in the book, and this is something that I have been really bringing up in conversations recently, because when I hear from leaders, I hear from managers, I hear people are tired. They're exhausted. There's a lot of anxiety. There's still quite a lot of fear. And that's not true for everybody, but that's true for a lot of people still. And so when I hear that, I really want to come around to, and I wish that I had included this, grit is critical, but it's not a sustainable operating mode. And so you've got to do the work to set the boundaries and take care of yourself. It's putting on your own oxygen mask first. We don't have an oxygen mask on the Apache. We flew way too low. But remember, you can't take care of others, whether they're your family, your partner, your spouse, your children, your team, your organization, unless you're able to take care of yourself first. So it's okay to set those boundaries. Not only is it okay, it needs to be part of your job right now to set boundaries to take care of yourself, whatever that means. And explore something new. Maybe you're learning French. I've just started doing French on Duolingo. It kind of breaks up the way that your mind is focused on those things that sometimes aren't always positive. And then take time to be in relationship, whether that's on Zoom because you live alone or whether that's with your family. And then take time to get away from your family, right? Whether that's going for a walk. I've got 2 kids at home, and we've had a lot of quality time that I would never give up, but wow, we also have had a lot of time. So go for a walk, a long walk, and take the time you need to be in the place you need to be to lead, to be in the place that you need to be to contribute the most and in the best way that you possibly can. So I wish that I had had that in the book, and I offer that to you right now.
Yes, self-care is definitely very important, especially now these days. I think,
Absolutely.
Patty, you have a question. Oh, you're on mute, Patty.
Okay, we've got some questions coming in also. So Don asks, how do you handle failure or not having the capability of doing something well?
That's a very important question. And don't remember all of my stories that I tell you now, because I'm going to tell you a few of them again in August, but we'll come up with new ways to discuss them as well also. Fear and failure are 2 things that every single one of us faces, whether or not we admit it. And again, I encourage leaders and managers to share their experiences with that, because it really does promote an environment of taking care of each other and being willing to take risks. But fear and failure are still terrifying for a lot of us, always. And so the first thing to do is to know that you're in good company. We all face it. I'll tell you a couple of good stories later this year where it was a very real thing in the cockpit and out of the cockpit. And what I like to say about fear and failure is that they're big and they're bulky, right? That cockpit only holds 2 pilots and a small publications bag and a power bar and a Diet Coke, because I've tried everything else. You can't fit anything else in that cockpit. And all of you are in your own cockpits, facing fear and facing failure at different points. But they're big and bulky and they don't fit in there. So think about fear, think about failure, not only as part of the normal human experience that you share with every single other person, whether or not they admit it, but also just as another form of resistance. And you remember what we did on takeoff with resistance. We turn towards it and you fly directly through it. That's the only way to take on fear and failure, is to turn towards it, not away from it. Any sailor knows you don't take the wave to the side. In the aircraft, you don't fly sideways into the wind, you turn towards it and you fly directly through it. If that means that you feel that you don't have the capabilities of doing something, then set your goals and take one small step, and then take another small step, and then take another small step. And cumulatively, those small steps will bring you where it is that you need to be. But you've got to set that goal on the horizon so that you can take that small step, facing towards that resistance, facing towards that fear, or facing towards that failure. And I'd like to say that failure is not what matters. Failure is part of the path to success for every single one of us. It's not failure that matters, it's what you do with it that counts. So you turn towards it and you get up one more time than you fall down.
So it sounds like everything is about vulnerable leadership, allowing yourself to fail, allowing yourself to look imperfect in front of people, which is a hard thing for a lot of people to do. It's certainly great to hear those messages.
Yes.
We have another question that's come in, which is really, I think, a very interesting one. So, and this is all about how you are perceived by others. How do you walk the fine line between passion versus perceived forcefulness or aggression? Because not everyone is going to receive your desire to succeed the same way.
That's a really good question. And I will tell you that most of us, I would say, at least for me, our greatest strength is also our greatest weakness, right? I have a lot of passion, I have a lot of energy, and I have experienced that as well, that there's some people that kind of say, whoa, that's a bit much. It works very well when I'm presenting. There are other circumstances where I have to change an approach for sure. Like working on a nonprofit board, I've had to step kind of way back because it works quite differently. And that is, I think, part of realizing that every context is different and every person is different. So doing that thoughtful work to say, hey, what is this context? Who are the people that I'm working with? How is it that I can be most successful in this context? Because it's not always going to require the same approach. In fact, every context requires a slightly different approach. At the same time, I want to come back to that authenticity, because there is some component that at the end of the day, not everyone's going to love you, and that's okay. In fact, not everyone's going to like you, and that's okay. It's about, and that this comes up in actually many of the interviews that I did with some of the leaders of the Grit Factor. Not about being liked, it's about being respected. Now, of course, you take care of people along the way, you respect others along the way, but you also have to be true to who you are. And if you're a passionate person, find a way to contribute where your passion is an asset. That's not going to be the case in every place. I would not be good in a number of roles, but I think I'm outstanding in other roles, and that's true for every single one of you. So doing the work to understand your strengths and where they can best contribute, and doing the work as well to understand how to engage in different contexts, I think is really important. But if someone's telling you not to be you, well, that's where you've got to kind of back up and say, hey, this is who I am, and this is how I'm able to contribute. Not everyone's going to necessarily love it, and that's okay. Then also be as gentle with others where you may not necessarily love the way that they contribute. So that's the challenge. I think it's, all of us bring such diverse experiences to the table, which is a very important way to really come up with the best results, right? To have the strongest team is to have a diverse way of approaching things, to have diverse experiences, to have a diverse team that is shown again and again to improve the bottom line and to promote stronger teams. That also means that we have to learn to work with people that have different approaches and respect our own approaches as well as we respect others. So it is absolutely a dance. It's one that takes some experience. I actually would recommend it with respect to this specific question, depending on what your role is, that a mentor is a really good idea in this case, or a coach as well. So both of those are very helpful places to be able to kind of throw ideas out and say, hey, how do I negotiate this particular interaction? And you'll learn over time how to make that work. But a great question, because that's one that we all do need to address at various points.
You kind of touched on it before, but I think we would like to dive a little bit deeper because we are in the home delivery world. It is such a very male-dominated industry, not unlike the armed forces. What is something that men can do to be better allies to women at work?
That's a great question. There's actually a great book called Good Guys, which is out recently as well, also from Harvard Business Review Press, which I definitely recommend. It was written by 2 naval officers who are teachers. I think one is at Johns Hopkins, maybe, and one's at the Naval Academy. So pick up the book Good Guys. They actually have a previous book as well. And that is about being a male ally. So I think that's a really important thing to understand, number one, that it's important, and number 2, to work to do it. So thank you for that question, whoever asked that question. The other thing I would say is there are 3 things that I would bring up as the first places to start. The first is to understand the studies. The study, you can look at the research. It's pretty clear that there are ways of operating that don't necessarily support a woman coming into a male-dominated world. And so as a manager or as a leader, one of the things you need to know is that women don't ask for a job or ask for a promotion until they're about 150% qualified. The studies show this. Men ask for that job or that promotion when they're about 50% qualified. Now, it's no slight on men, it's no slight on women, it's just what the studies show. So if you want the best leader or the best manager for a position, then I would go out and solicit people to apply. I would go out and say, hey, Lisa over here or Sally over here, I know they do outstanding work. I want them to apply for that job, even if they're not going to. I know that the studies show that they're less likely to apply unless they're overqualified. And the men that I get may be underqualified. So if you want the best person, do the work as the leader or the manager to seek out who those candidates might be, understanding what those studies show. So that's number 1. Number 2 is to tell stories. Look at the stories that you tell in your organization. Stories are not just told the way that I'm talking to you now, verbally, or even writing in a book, but they're also told in the stories that you tell at your meetings, at your sales meetings, at your managers' meetings. They're told in the pictures that you have up on your website. They're told in the pictures of your board or your leadership. If they're all white male, you're telling a story. If those pictures that are up on the wall in the office, once you all go back in the office, are all white male, that's telling a story. And I would do the work to change that story, whatever that means. And you know that that means a lot of different things. But to start with, in your meetings, until you started to look at how to make a leadership more diverse and more vibrant, and I haven't gone to look at your website, so I'm not actually referring this to you at all, but just generally consider if the story that you're telling is the one that you want to be telling. Does it represent everybody that you want to be contributing in the way that they can best contribute? And if not, how can you change that story? And one way is to go out, read The Grit Factor, read other books and other stories that give you the examples to share in your management meetings, in your leadership meetings, in your sales meetings, where you can go and say, hey, have you ever heard the story of, man, Ann Dunwoody? She's the first woman 4-star in the US Army. Can you imagine when she first went to, tell those stories. Teach them to yourself, because they're not usually the stories that are shared. They're not usually the stories that are elevated. They might just show up in a newspaper once, and then they're not the ones that our society tends to share. So teach yourself and share those stories, and ensure your story is aligned to your values. So that's 2 things. The last thing is accountability. If there is ever any kind of behavior that in any way demeans a woman, you have to have a 0 tolerance for that behavior. And by 0 tolerance, I think you asked that person very nicely to find another place to work. That's my recommendation. And that would be my recommendation to leadership if they want to know how you support women in an all-male industry. If there is behavior that is disrespectful, you show absolutely 0 tolerance. If there is behavior that's harassment or worse, of course you show 0 tolerance. But unfortunately, in a lot of organizations, that's not the case. So to be an ally, understand, go out and solicit people to be leaders, knowing they won't bring themselves to the table. Make sure you're telling the right stories and that you're changing your story to reflect your values if you need to. And finally, have absolutely 0 tolerance for any kind of disrespect.
Yes, absolutely. As far as being a woman who has been the first, and you are, it's amazing. You were so young to be, a first woman in the Army. And I mean, being in military, that's just a prime environment to not be accepted, right? What advice would you give women that are in the home delivery industry that do find themselves being maybe the only woman sometimes? What advice would you give them as far as, pushing through and, working towards their goals?
Yeah, well, first of all, read The Grit Factor. I'm sorry to keep write it for you for this exact question. And actually for men as well. I mean, it is leadership for men and women and men. So first of all, I would say, do that work that we talked about earlier of grounding yourself in your own story. Understand what your strengths are, understand what your values are and what you bring to the table, what you've learned through the challenges in your life, and drill down to core purpose and do that same work and stay connected to that. The second part in the learn phase, and we didn't talk a whole lot about this today, but one of the pieces that I think is really important for all of us to do thoughtfully, it's not something to just kind of rely on whatever's there, but to think about how you can build your team. Because one of the things that's very clear for all of us, even if we were one of the first or we were the only woman in 120 male combat pilots, is you don't do it alone. You've got to have your team. And your team, and I talk about this in very specific detail in this book. There's also a great book called Good People by Anthony Tan that talks about this as well, where we look at who's in your inner circle, who is, if it's a spouse or a partner or a very close friend, somebody that you can talk to and talk to regularly and rely on for support, but also potentially a mentor. And a mentor is somebody that is usually more strategic, right? Somebody you can reach out and say, hey, I'm thinking about this transition. How should I think about this? Or I'm thinking about this kind of a job application or changing roles. How should I consider this? What should I do? So that's really people that you can be completely and totally vulnerable with, right? We talked about vulnerability earlier, and there's certainly times and places for different levels of that. But also looking for mentorship. And I think one of the key things to understand about mentorship is, if you're a woman, you should not have only woman mentors, right? Women mentors. You should have male and women as female mentors, especially in a field that is male dominated, because in a field where there's a particular group in power, in a sense, it's not in power as though they've taken it, but it's in power because that's the majority. You want to make sure you have a mentor in that group, because that mentor can help you negotiate some of the challenges that might come from being in that kind of environment specifically. So don't keep yourself confined to a woman mentor just because you're a woman. And if you have a mentorship program in your company, don't just assign like genders to like genders. It's not the right way to do it. There should be some other point of connection. But you also want to have a colleague or two that you can rely on as well and say, hey, I've got this tactical challenge. What do you think about this? And so think strategically about building that team that can support you in the tough times. I think that's a really important thing, is to know that you don't have to do it alone. You shouldn't do it alone. Nobody that's successful does it alone. You've got to have your team. And also it is sometimes lonely. So that's part of the process. The second thing is, besides what we've talked about already today, I would say that I have this grit triad, right? Commit, learn, and launch. It's surrounded by a mindset. And I'm talking more and more about mindset lately, and I'm actually quite taken by it. But mindset is a conscious choice. So in the face of challenge, whether it is a really hard person to deal with, whether it's a really difficult circumstance, whether it's a global pandemic, whatever it is, the mindset of how you approach that challenge is a choice. It doesn't mean it's an easy choice. And it doesn't mean it's an easy thing to live into. But one of the things that came out of studies of POWs in Vietnam, and these are POWs at the Hanoi Hilton, held sometimes for 4 years in horrific conditions and tortured and huge deprivation, is that the thing that was most connected to their success in surviving that and reintegrating back into the world was optimism. Now, not Pollyannish optimism, but grounded optimism. And so Admiral Stockdale, who was held at the Hanoi Hilton for 7.5 years, he had his legs broken 3 times. He was tortured mercilessly in solitary confinement for half of his time there. Says, you must never, ever lose faith that you will ultimately prevail in the end, which is faith you cannot afford to lose, while balancing that with the realities of your day. So those sometimes are brutal realities. You've got to keep those you don't avoid those. You don't look away from those. You have to address those. Remember, you face towards those difficulties, but you can also never, ever lose faith that you will ultimately prevail in the end, that you will get through this, that we will get through this, and we will get through it together.
Absolutely. I can't wait for August, and hopefully everything is great for all of us to be there in person to hear more from you, and definitely can't wait to pick up the book. Patty, do you have any other questions on your list?
I think we've gotten through all the questions. Do we have any other questions from the audience? I'm not seeing any more come in.
All right. Well,
Yeah.
I think we can wrap up. Shannon, I thank you again so much for being here. We will be doing more webinars, and look forward to our additional calendars, which we'll announce. And I believe Don is going to close us out for today.
Yeah, thank you, Shannon Huffman Polson, and great presentation. And Natasha and Patty Johnston from the Women's Home Delivery Council for putting this all together. I want to remind everybody that Shannon will be one of the speakers at our National Home Delivery Forum on August 2nd, 3rd, and 4th. You can go to our website, nationalhomedeliveryassociation.com. I know it's a mouthful, but if you go to events, you can both register for the event, and you can also get discount hotel reservations through a link on that account as well. So thank you again, everybody, and great presentation. Thank you all. Have a great week now.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.